Yeah, excellent. Sounds like there are still a lot of folks out in the hallway, is that right? I wonder if somebody could give them a shout. Should we just...
Some would be willing to be a bit of a ringleader though and try to
might be helpful.
chase people in a little bit.
Yeah, great. Somebody's got a big mouth. Yeah.
We're sitting all day. Before we send you home? Yes.
Yeah. That's why, yeah, we want to move the agenda along here. Let me just say again, I am not an expert. Lundy, I was sharing with folks this morning, I've been a practitioner for 25 years, and I'm a fairly careful student of the literature. I try to follow what's going on with the research community. And just, want to take the opportunity to say I embrace your stuff to a huge extent. I mean, we use your risk assessment tools, and Minnesota's been, I think, a good partner with you in a lot of respects. So I am not detracting from his message at all here. I'm hoping to ask some complementary, i.e. more fleshed out questions to round out the picture. And as I said this morning, I'm willing to be wrong and I'm willing to be persuaded. I don't have a particular ideological commitment here. But some things I struggle with and some concerns that I have, and I just, Lundy's been very gracious in being willing to respond to, and perhaps some others share as well. One thing that seems concerning to me is simply, the operational definition of battering and batterer. And when do we know we're there and when aren't we? So is this a clinical diagnosis, and at what point can we safely say that someone is, in fact, a batterer? Because it seems to me that then so much follows from that in terms of the system's response, how we all need to interact with this person, the risk assessment, contact with kids, and so forth. I mean, when is he in and when is he out?
And do you have a working way that you've been making that definition?
Well, I mean, we tend to talk about chronic and severe violence over time and some of the chronicity indicators. But you seem to be suggesting that even one incident
my definition would be that he had exercised a pattern of coercive control. There was a pattern of bullying and intimidation that in its day-to-day flavor may be primarily about verbal and psychological abuse, it may be primarily about economic abuse, it may be primarily about sexual mistreatment, it may be primarily about using the children as weapons against her. In other words, the most common day-to-day flavor of this pattern of coercive control is not necessarily about the physical violence, but that the pattern of behavior includes at least some element of either physical violence, sexual violence, or credible physical threat. In other words, a threat that was believable. If you don't stop, if you don't shut up, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Someday I'm going to kill you. I'm digging a grave for you in the backyard. Something that would be reasonably expected to put a woman in fear.
Yeah.
So it requires two pieces by the definition I work from. It requires that it be part of a pattern of coercive control, and that it have at least some element of physical or sexual violence or credible threat of physical or sexual violence. It doesn't necessarily have to be a stated threat. Again, a raised fist it can be a very credible threat, but a credible threat nonetheless.
Okay. You were talking earlier about the research article that you read, where the author was describing the lack of scientific underpinning for some of the personality disorder diagnoses, and urging caution about using those diagnostic labels. Do you have any concern at all that we should be more cautious with the label battering and batterer?
I'm not sure where at the moment it's being used too wildly. If I knew in the context where it was being used too wildly, I was really concerned about that. I'm still, as I say, continue to be more concerned about the under-identifying battering men than the over-identifying of battering men. But what this article is saying about the personality disorders is that, first of all, as they're currently defined, most clients who are coming in don't fit one set of criteria in a way that distinctly makes it that they have this personality disorder and not these other personality disorders.
Right.
And then, in fact, according to this article, the most commonly used personality disorder diagnosis currently is the NOS, the personality disorder not otherwise specified, because they're not managing to. The other problem is that the person, there's a lack of chronological consistency. In other words, a person evaluated 2 years later is often showing quite a different set of symptoms, such that they might actually be awarded a different personality disorder at that point, or no personality disorder at all. So the notion that these are actually underlying structures that are predictable and stable in the person are not bearing up for most of these. Now, I don't find those things so far in someone who's being labeled as a batterer. We got a definition that's pretty well will distinguish him, I believe, adequately from a non-battering man. If it isn't, then if it's not doing that, then we need to refine it further. And it will be pretty consistent over time. In other words, I don't think we'll find that he came in this time, we did the history taking, he got defined as a batterer, but 3 years later, he would suddenly not look like that at all. So.
Yeah. Okay. Jack Westman at UW-Madison. You need to get cranked up. He's a children's rights advocate and somebody I admire a lot. Talks about how, on average, men are twice the body mass of women, twice as strong. And of course, we know they're sociologically much more violent, responsible for most social violence. Whereas parents tend to be 5 times greater body mass and 5 times stronger than your average toddler. And yet, when we talk about interpersonal violence between men and women, we describe that as battering. My question is, why wouldn't a mother beating her child be called a batterer?
I think some of this just becomes a matter of what we decide to have terms mean. Right. Because I often get, for example, people ask me, well, how about the woman who is physically violent towards a non-battering man? She's not using defensive violence. She truly is the perpetrator of violence in that relationship. Why don't I call her a batterer? Well, because the term batterer has come to mean a certain profile, a certain set of behaviors, a certain set of attitudes that's established in the research that we don't know if it applies to the woman who's the female perpetrator of domestic violence. We know that she does harm. We know that she can be very dangerous in certain cases, but we don't know that she has these attitudes and behaviors that I'm described because we lack both the clinical experience and the research to establish that. Does that mean she's necessarily way better? No, it just means we need a different term so that we don't start relying on a body of research and a set of clinical experience and assuming that those things are going to be true of her. When, for example, the people nationally who are doing rehabilitation programs with female perpetrators of domestic violence are reporting without exception across the country that the population they're ending up working with doesn't very well, or it doesn't entirely, that it only about half seems to fit the profile that's been so well established for the battering man. So the terminology is important. And that's why I think it's important to use the term child abuser rather than batterer. Can a woman who beats her children be incredibly destructive? Absolutely. And there are very, very powerful personal stories from men and women who in their childhood were beaten or sexually abused by their mothers. I'm not in any sense attempting to idealize mothers as parents. We're talking about a particular kind of power of destructiveness that's available to a man who's got the mother and the family simultaneously terrorized. And we're talking, as you point out also, about kind of what our overall societal statistics are about who's doing the lion's share of physical violence, who's most trained to use it, who has the most skills, and it's this sort of a sick way to use the term, but who has the most skills in their ability to use really lethal violence. And for example, Murray Strauss, with whom I frequently disagree because of the ways that I believe he overemphasizes female violence, even Murray Strauss continues to say male violence needs to be our top priority because of how widespread it is and because of how severe the consequences are. But we need as a society to become much more serious about not tolerating violence, period. And the child. And you know, I deal with parents in public situations, subway trains and so forth, airplane. I mean, I got into a big blowout with a woman on an airplane a few weeks ago because she wasn't hitting her child, but she was just being psychologically vicious to him. So I think the problem of child abuse is its own area with its own power dynamics, and I think your point is well taken. It shouldn't be backed away from or minimized or prettied up in any way.
Thank you for that response. You know, not to belabor the labeling issue, I just find, you know, I consider myself a humanistic social worker, and when I hear labels like crack mom or welfare mom or meth mom or deadbeat dad, it just elicits in me this feeling that we've reduced the humanity of that person by pigeonholing them in this label, and that somehow that robs their essential humanity in certain very important ways, and may even have them living down to the label that we've given them. Kids who have been labeled problem kids, as I was at one point in my Catholic school days. Go to the corner, you're a problem child. So I just express that concern. I don't expect you to, you know, come up with a response to that. It's just, it feels sometimes to me like it's overworked. That'd just be my reflection.
I think it's a real problem. I've really resisted, for example, the labeling of teens who are beginning to show teen dating violence behavior as teen batterers, because I feel like that's actually in certain ways, as you say, going to help them live down to it. It's going to help them settle into the idea that that's who they are. I still feel today that our problem with men who batter continues to be a much more problem of underreaction and overreaction, of underlabeling rather than overlabeling. But I continue to believe in the humanity of the clients that I was working with until a couple of years back, and I actually continue to argue in the face of some get in some debates with people who are saying batters can't change, to continue to say we actually need to believe that batters can change. We actually, ironically, in many ways, serve batters' interests, believe it or not, when we declare that they're incapable of changing. That's a whole other discussion. And the trick in batter work, which maybe I'll talk about later this afternoon, is how do you make a real human connection with your client without thereby enabling them? And that's not very easy to do, because unfortunately batters, sadly, tend to interpret a real human connection with them as meaning that you believe what they've done isn't that bad. And so it's a really tricky thing to do. But I think we have to work out better ways to do it.
Yeah, thank you. That actually was to my next point, which is, is there a set of, I'll use a clinical term, discharge criteria or conditions of satisfaction such that we know when a batterer is safe enough to have contact with his child? I mean, and who gets to say so?
Yeah.
Is it properly in the courts, or really is it a clinical judgment?
And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think that we've been going so far to the extreme of allowing abusers almost unfettered access to their children that we haven't even begun to look at, well, what are really reasonable and careful ways to decide when's the time for batters to have unsupervised access, or to have more unsupervised access, or to even be granted overnights, which I wish would be, very much an exception, the granting of overnight visitation to batters. We have some clinically established measures of change in men who batter that I consider very logical, reasonable, well-formulated. They have not been tested by any huge amount of research. They're very much common sense and based on clinical experience. To call it a clinical assessment, I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to get to something that you can tell in an office. It's again going to require so much reliance on reports from mom, reports from other collaterals. But it's one of the things that we're going to examine this afternoon is what are meaningful measures. Batters are being declared has changed men on the basis of absolutely spurious measures. And we'll look some this afternoon at what actually would be meaningful measures, and what happens in cases where we do see batterers make really big changes, because there are times when we do.
Yeah.
And what does that look like?
Yeah, fair enough. There's a certain, I don't know if anybody else feels this way or sees this, but it almost as though there's a circular reasoning kind of trap here that implies a sort of fait accompli. So the abusive man displays these behaviors, suspected batterer, and then it sounds like pretty much any behavior at all could be construed as further evidence of the fact that he may likely be a batterer. So if he is smooth and manipulative, well, many batterers are smooth and manipulative. If he admits to a little bit of abuse, that might be covering up a lot of abuse. If he starts showing up at the kids' medical appointments and school appointments, that could be an indication that he's just trying to insert himself in control. And so there's a sort of, do you see what I'm saying? There's a certain circular logic to the thing, which is self-reinforcing, that seems kind of problematic to me, that once you're in that loop, that there's almost nothing the guy can do to get off the treadmill.
So let me clarify that I don't mean that those things are indicators of abuse. What I mean is that because those things come so commonly with abuse, we need to not stop the investigation at that point. I don't mean that therefore that's a conclusion that he's an abuser, or that if he is an abuser, he's in the category of abusers who are really going to be really psychologically harmful to their children. What I think abusers do, and sometimes the lawyers who represent them do, is to try to get the investigation to stop, to sort of put up reasons why we don't need to bother to go forth from here. Because he is too nice a guy, or because he did show up to the medical appointments, or because she got violent sometimes too, or because she got really verbally, to try to focus on the victim's behavior, and to just create these stopping points where we don't look beyond. And so what I mean with those points is much more is to not be stopped at that point, and to make sure we go forward into what our other possible sources of information evidence are. Because yeah, you're right. That's the kind of thing, it drives me crazy in just my personal life sometimes, having nothing to do with domestic violence. How we've become a society that's so focused on denial that the fact that you're saying you don't have a problem has become proof that you do. So I agree with you on that. That can drive you nuts.
Well done, well done. You cited Murray Strauss earlier, and then you just mentioned Murray again, and he's got an article in the current copy of the current Controversies on Family Violence, Sage Press 2005, entitled "Women's Violence Toward Men is a Serious Social Problem," in which he goes on to report on the hundreds of national and international incidence studies, which he says all show approximate rates of female to male and male to female interpersonal conflict, violent tactics. Of course, and then Murray is always careful to put the caveat, men are much more destructive, and the consequences for women are much more serious, and that's why we have to have that as our top priority. But one wouldn't know from listening to your presentation this morning that it were a serious social problem at all, and then you made that nice explanation. You're not talking about other kinds of issues. But one could walk away from your presentation, I think, thinking that perhaps it's female-initiated violence is not serious enough to warrant our attention. And I'll just finish up then with my last point. A related point then, as a child protection worker and a guardian ad litem, and someone who really believes in children's rights, is family violence is not, as far as I can tell, and in my own experience, an exclusively male problem. The Children's Bureau reported that for 2004, 60% of all maltreatment committed by parents was committed by female caretakers, and that we had equal rates, 20% and 20% of physical abuse by moms and dads, and then the non-accidental child fatality rates were equally distributed as well. So I put that out there so that people aren't walking away from here thinking that men are the problem, and that's the only problem. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but just be careful, with the statistical studies. And I'll just wrap my whole thing up here. I try to train our guardians ad litem to be careful with labels. Most of them aren't clinicians, and they shouldn't be spewing diagnostic labels. That they should be careful of caricatures, that human beings are complex. Families are complex. Every family is unique. Every human being is unique. And to squeeze them onto the rack of an ideological or political agenda is doing damage to those real human beings. So if someone is being constructed as a caricature, much like how we construct, the evil empire and the terrorism, in other countries, that always should elicit a little concern on our part, the demonizing of the other. Be careful about confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, you start out with a certain impression, and then you gather evidence to confirm over and over again that yes, your initial impression was correct. And then finally, the clinical fallacy. If you have a certain experience with a certain subset of the population for a long enough time, the whole world starts to seem like they're made up of those people, right? And so you have to be very careful about extrapolating from that and applying those lessons to everybody else that you encounter. So those are just, things that we try to put out there in terms of being careful, mindful practitioners so we don't do damage to families and kids.
So thank you for that whole set of points, and I'll say a few things in response to that. I'm very concerned right now in Massachusetts about a tone that seems to have become kind of acceptable among child protective workers to talk about parents in general, mothers or fathers, in these very, very disparaging, superior ways, and as you're saying, just absolutely summing people up as being this one kind of person, and I really resonate with that concern. And I have some additional reasons why I get concerned when people start to talk about men who batter as monsters, for example, because that has a very serious practical impact, which is that most batters don't look like monsters, and so when people don't talk like monsters and don't act like monsters, certainly outside of the home. So when he doesn't look that way, since they expect batters to be monsters, he couldn't be one, and he skates. So there are ways, as I say, that seeing batters as monsters ends up ironically making them more able rather than less able to abuse. Murray Strauss and I have some very different views on this female-initiated violence thing, and actually about a year ago I got to debate him on the radio, which was really interesting and in certain ways disturbing. But Murray Strauss comes from a place where he absolutely has very, very strong feelings against violence of all kinds, and absolutely wants children to live in violence-free environment. And in that sense, I'm totally with him.
Helped launch the shelter movement in this country, actually.
Yeah. And I don't want us to somehow idealize women as parents and say that child abuse is done by men. When you say that there's roughly equal physical abuse done by women and by men, or that women are responsible in this other study for about 60% of abuse of children, we have to take into account that children are spending 90% or more of their parenting time with their mothers. So that still shows that per hour that parents spend with their children, a father is a considerably greater risk. And so I mean those things have to be in the mix also. And when Strauss points to all these studies that show roughly equal levels of violence between males and females, he's cherry picking. Because a sociologist from State University of New York, Stony Brook, Michael Kimmel, did a very thoroughgoing review of domestic violence studies. He looked at about 1,000 studies, and he found about 100 that showed roughly equal levels of violence between males and females, and 900 that showed significantly higher rates of male violence than female violence towards intimate partners. So the overwhelming majority of studies still find that there's substantially more male on female than female on male violence. What I think matters much more, however, again, practically, than whether this happens 90% of the time or this happens 50% of the time is how do we deal with a particular case? In a particular case, I have been involved professionally. Can't remember at the moment if it's come up in my personal life or not. I'd have to think about it, but I know I've been involved professionally in cases where the man was not a batterer, the woman's violence was not a response to his violence. She was the perpetrator of violence in that relationship, and his life had become, it wasn't the same as a battered woman. He wasn't in the same position that a battered woman was in, but he was in a really rough position. I've talked to adults who grew up in homes where their mother was much more the violent one than their father in that home. And the nature of the experience that they're describing is not coming out that dramatically different from children who grew up in homes where their father was the violent one. So even if I'm saying I believe these kinds of problems are much more common than these other kinds of problems, I'm not at all saying that therefore when this one arises, we can take it lightly. It's the same thing with same-sex battering. We're not going to run into nearly as many cases of a woman who's being abused by her lesbian partner or a man who's being abused by his gay male partner. But according to the research that we do have, which isn't nearly as much, by the way, because the same-sex battering hasn't been researched nearly as much as heterosexual battering, but the research that there is indicates that a person who's being battered by a same-sex partner has about the same chance of being killed as a woman who's being abused by a male partner. The man, by the way, who's being abused by a female partner is not at a very high homicide risk. But his life, particularly once they break up, by the way, post-separation, heterosexual homicide is almost entirely male on female. The female and male homicides that tend to happen while couples are still together. But boy, can his life be hell, and can the children's life be hell. So thank you. I definitely want to be called out on it if it comes out sounding like any kind of minimizing of what those other experiences can be and can mean. And finally, I just want to talk about battering as a diagnostic label. Battering, the definition of someone as a battering man is not currently a clinical decision. It does not exist as a diagnostic category in the diagnostic manual at this point. And it's really a decision actually that domestic violence professionals are still in a better position to make than clinicians are. Domestic violence professionals have much more training at this point than clinicians have to determine who's a batterer and who is not. That doesn't mean it's always being made well. I'm just saying so far that's not a part of anyone's clinical training or part of what is considered clinical diagnosis. We run into a lot of problems in the custody arena because of the mistaken belief that a batterer should look a certain kind of way in his psychological testing when there's no reason why he should look any particular way in his psychological testing. And the psychological testing isn't going to tell us much of anything about domestic violence or child sexual abuse allegations. So.
Very good. Can I make just a closing? One
Yeah,
more?
please.
And then I'm going to say goodbye to everybody.
We still got another 5 minutes.
I've got a little
it's all yours.
legislative thing going on. Just another observation, and take it for what it's worth, but you actually just did it a moment ago when you talked about, one hastens to add that the majority of time spent with children is done by female caregivers. So of course you're going to have a higher incidence of child maltreatment. They're with the kids most often. I see other examples of what I would call an exculpatory interpretation of statistics and behaviors, both at the societal level and at the individual level, in which one hastens to add an explanatory framework that is defensive, well, not defensive, but is really humanistic. And you do that, it seems to me, from the woman's point of view, which is fine. But let me offer, and then the opposite of that would be an incriminating interpretation or a damning interpretation. I've done a fair bit of work with vets suffering from PTSD coming back from the Gulf. Many of you will recall in the first Gulf War, there was that whole rash of incidents of domestic homicides and severe battering when those vets came back. We know from the research, sound research, that PTSD is highly correlated with interpartner violence. And so an exculpatory or generous interpretation and a humanistic response in my book would be, what kind of outreach are we doing to those guys to prepare them to re-entry, to assimilate with their families, to minimize their PTSD symptoms? When you talked about the depression and despondency, which is a risk factor for men being homicidally lethal? Where are the social programs to reach out to those depressed and despondent fathers who have lost everything in their lives that they thought they were working for? And so I'm going to close with a plea for a humanistic, holistic approach to dealing with the entire problem of family violence, which includes efforts to bring men into the fold and develop their skills as caregivers, empathetic dads, good men, so that we can all attack the problem of family and social violence. I'm sorry, I'm editorializing a little. I feel passionately about how much violence is going on out there in our society, and we've got to get on the ball to deal with all of it. All of it. So, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
We had a program where, I think it still exists actually, where I live in Massachusetts, that was where our counseling program for men who batter was having a presence in court, the way you might have a court advocate for battered women present in the court. And as soon as the guy had a protective order ordered against him by the judge, would sit down and meet with him. And this is related to what Mark was just saying. They were stating that they were seeing better compliance with protective orders by these men from the fact that that somebody was making contact with them from the very beginning, starting to build some kind of connection and relationship with them, making sure that they really understood what the order demanded of them, making sure that they really understood the consequences of violating the order. These were not people who were going to feel sorry for him or start letting him off the hook, but they were people who were going to make a human kind of connection with him. I think we have to be very, very careful. I wish Mark hadn't had to go, but I understand he's really under pressure about this other issue he has to deal with. I think we have to be very, very careful, however, about the times, because what I see happen a lot in cases is times when people saying we've got to treat this father as a human being, we've got to do a humane kind of outreach to him in a way that then backfires against the children. And why is that any more, I don't understand why that's any more humanistic. And I think I actually very much believe in a humanistic approach, but I believe that we can't do that in a way that abandons, in effect, what's right or fair for the mom, and what's right or fair for the children. And when someone tells me that there are these statistics that show that men and women are guilty of roughly equal amounts of child abuse, and I say, but wait a minute, here's why that actually doesn't line up, I don't feel like that's exculpatory. I don't feel like that's trying to let female child abusers off the hook. That's trying to say, no, wait a minute, we can't let these other people off the hook. And there's a general need in a lot of different places for accountability, period. And we need greatly, greatly expanded monitoring and accountability for batterers. But we have the need to expand accountability for all kinds of people in all kinds of places. In presidents of countries and all kinds of things, where there's some need for people to actually be held accountable for their actions, for there to be some consequences for lying and things like that. So let's. Since you folks now had to just listen while that whole point and counterpoint happened, I'm going to say one quick comment related to this, and then I want to have some time that's just open for questions and comments. There doesn't have to be a question, to comments, disagreements, and then we'll try to do a couple other pieces. I want to talk quickly about this whole concept of spectrum risk assessment that I've been talking about, versus typology type risk assessment, which tries to say we can put batterers into different types. And there have been a few efforts to create batterer typologies. Amy Holtzworth Monroe created one way back in the early 90s. Janet Johnston created one in the later 90s. Janet Johnston, Linda Campbell, Vivian Roseby. Well, I guess it was Jocelyn Campbell, that I spent most of a chapter in The Batterer's Parent showing what happens when you actually apply that typology and why it's so destructive. And then the latest typology to rear its head is the common couples violence versus true batterer, what they call the patriarchal terrorist, And I don't, none of these typologies that I've examined stand up very well to careful examination because the types are not clearly enough defined and you can't figure out who's going to fit. I tried to apply Janet Johnson's typology and I couldn't figure out where most of my clients would go because the overwhelming majority of my clients would not have fit any of her types. Because the batterer who was very psychologically abusive but not terribly physically violent, which was true of probably 2/3 of my clients, she didn't have a spot for it. You had to either pick that he was not very violent and not very psychologically abusive, or that he was very violent and very psychologically abusive, so you were stuck. And also, her category, which is similar to the common couples violence versus true battering categories, and her category of the one that was sort of mutually provoked violence, where the reason the woman got hurt was just because the man was the stronger and the better fighter, not because he was in any way more responsible for the conflict. She would give examples of the kinds of things that the woman had done that had fed the conflict, that would include things like she attempted to leave the room. This was Janet Johnson. I quoted this. You wouldn't believe it if I didn't quote it. But I quote it in The Batterer's Parent because she would say that was one of the ways that she was contributing to the escalation of this conflict, was by attempting to leave. Well, that's what happens when you start to create these kinds of typologies. Now, one other thing I think is really important is these folks, Lingen, one of those names I can't pronounce, Lingenstick or something, Langen, I don't know. It wasn't French, it was German or Swedish, but anyhow, the letters where you leave, well, any of those languages where you leave out most of the letters when you pronounce the word. Of course, you could say that about English, couldn't you? We skip a lot of the letters in our words, too. My original language was Spanish. Spanish, you just pronounce everything exactly the way it's written. It's such a blessing. They, using one of these common typologies of batterers, then created fact patterns and asked a team of psychologists to assign these cases to the types. And then did statistical work on whether there was any statistical consistency to where the psychologists assigned the cases, and there was not. So that there was, in other words, no clinical usefulness to these types because clinicians couldn't agree, given the same fact pattern, which of the type these things belong to. We solved, I believe, by doing spectrum risk work, we solved the whole problem. Now, one of the concerns that Mark is raising, which I think is a valid concern, is if this is a guy who either wasn't really violent, or he was violent, but his violence was not that severe, it was completely out of character for him, was not part of him really oppressing that woman in the relationship. He wasn't a bully, a dominating, intimidating person who was taking his partner's rights away over the course of the relationship. And we're going to suddenly start treating him as a batterer and keeping him away from his children. That's going to be very unfair to him. It is. But I don't think we avoid that by trying to figure out which category to put the batterer in. We avoid that by doing our proper spectrum risk assessment. Because if we do our proper spectrum risk assessment on an alleged domestic violence case, and he's either someone who wasn't a batterer or someone who did this common couples violence, who wasn't violent at all, or someone who did this common couples violence, he's going to come in really good when you do this spectrum assignment, and he's going to come out in the category of someone who should have unsupervised contact with his children. So in other words, we're not going to harm that guy if we treat it as a domestic violence case and do our proper risk assessment, because he's going to come out on the good end of the spectrum anyhow. If he comes out on the bad end of the spectrum, he's trouble for those children. And so I think I have watched, in Massachusetts in particular, what happens as evaluators start applying those typologies. And what happens is abusers who are being really destructive to children really get turned loose. That's what happens. It doesn't help. And I think the spectrum approach should address successfully both sets of concerns when we're really carefully addressing those elements that need to be addressed. So let's take some time in general for questions if you want to, and I can say a little more also about assessment, but we need to hear less from me for a little while, at least less presentation from me, and have some time for questions and comments. Yeah?
This morning I proposed that, and I did that last September at the annual Montana Bar Association meeting, that we set up a family court where the judges are MSWs with at least 5 years experience, and the practitioners are LPCs with at least 3 years experience. And my proposal would award the salary to the MSW judge the same salary that our district judges now have, and for the same term of office. And the appointment of the judges, we have by election now, our district judges, but the MSW judges would be appointed by the Chief Justice in consultation and with the consent of the then chairperson of the MSW examining board. What do you think about that? My point is that we lawyers are not trained for this sort of work.
I'm from far away from here, from Massachusetts, so I'm not I'm not in a great position to comment on what would work well in Montana. What I do know is that currently most training for an MSW, for a PhD in psychology, a PsyD, and various other, or an MED, in counseling psychology, generally don't include a lot of training in any form of abuse. There are exceptions to that, but your typical curriculum is not going to prepare someone in any deep way for questions of domestic violence or of child abuse, including child sexual abuse. So I think whatever structure you want to create, you have to also make sure there's really substantial additional training on sexual abuse. I mean, on abuse, on family abuse in all its forms. But there's another issue that I find goes beyond training, which is an issue of sensitivity. And I do a fair amount, not a tremendous amount, but I do a fair amount of training for judges around the country. And I had an experience, for example, in Oregon, with doing a training for judges where I then got reports over the ensuing couple of years that the judges had dramatically changed how they were responding to domestic violence cases. I did extensive training for judges in Massachusetts. I trained every judge in the state on handling custody and visitation cases involving domestic violence, and didn't see the slightest change of any kind. So you can train someone who has a sort of basic sensitivity and wants to be trained. And you can't train someone who's got a real chip on their shoulder about the issues the way a lot of, unfortunately, our Massachusetts judges do. And so it's just another thing that has to be factored into the mix, is how do we attract people to the bench who are sensitive, humanistic kind of people who really care about what's happening. I'm just appalled so often by how judges in our state are talking to everybody. Mothers, fathers, attorneys. They're just being rude and mean to their own employees. They're just being rude and mean to everybody that comes before them. And people who are in a family law proceeding are in pain. They're afraid. They're afraid for their children. They're afraid about what's going to happen to their relationships with their children. When it's a family with a domestic violence history, they're carrying all this additional pain in there, and they need kindness. They really, really need kindness and patience. It's almost, sometimes it's as important as what order the judge writes. We have a judge in Massachusetts who's known for being pretty good on domestic violence cases, and he's someone who I like kind of personally at lunchtime, but he's nasty on the bench. And I've had lawyers tell me that it's hard to convince their clients that they just won. When they come out of the hearing before Judge Sachs, because they've just been ripped to pieces. So, I just was handed a question of my experiences, revealed an effective means of encouraging judges to draw their own conclusions rather than relying upon evaluators' recommendations, and 2, to hold matters more tightly to the court's requirements. I don't know how much more I can add to that than what I have, that to really encourage judges to participate in not just general domestic violence training, but domestic violence training that's really specific to post-separation concerns. But the other thing is to build relationships. How many folks are judges in the room who are willing to have other people know that? It's really important for folks to sit down and talk to each other. And I have learned so much from listening to judges talk about, I have changed so much of what I say from listening to judges talk about what they have to do. And so again, it's one of those things like when I was talking about the battles with child protective workers, where we really have to have dialogue happening in two directions, where it's not just like what we need to train the judges on, but what judges need to tell us, what judges need from us that they're not getting. And I feel so strongly about this issue that we're very frustrated about at a lot of judges on domestic violence cases, but they're not having the information put before them that I believe they need to have put before them. And we have the systemic problem of trying to figure out how are we going to make it possible for judges to even have the information that they need. So I think the building of personal relationships is very helpful. I think having judges participate on domestic violence task force is very helpful where their administration, where their administrative office of the court will permit that, and that varies from state to state. In some states, judges are absolutely free to be on community task forces, and in some states that's considered that would prejudice them because they're involved on sort of the victim, somehow the victim end if they're on domestic violence task forces. Where's your state in its the freedom it allows, gives judges to participate in collaborations or community task forces, or you're allowed to be out there in discussions? That's great. That's great. That's great. Our judges in Massachusetts were actually forced to drop task forces that they were on domestic violence by the administrative office of the court, under the argument that if they knew too much, they would become biased. Domestic violence seems to stand out amongst all fields as a field in which it is believed that if you know too much, you can no longer be objective, and that it's really best to have people who are somewhat ill-informed on the subject. And I'm not saying about judges. I'm saying I run into this all the time about who should do custody evaluation, who should be the children's therapists, everything. You keep going, oh, this person knows too much about domestic violence. They won't be objective. It's an odd quirk in how people view this field that I don't see turn up in other areas where we really need you to know less in order to have you be objective. Yeah, Ann, go ahead.
Wendy, I think it would be helpful to see more examples of orders where judges have entered findings that would support a supervision order. Because the perception is, regardless of whatever evidentiary standard is in the statute, you're burdening a fundamental right when you supervise parenting, and it ought not to be done lightly. And at some level of findings, you've got enough, and and otherwise you don't. And I'm wondering, are there sources we could go to see what findings, at least from your perspective, should look like?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I know the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges has just released an updated guide to doing custody determination, and their revised guide is really quite good. I don't know if they've gotten, and I've skimmed through it. I haven't read it in detail yet. I don't see whether it got as concrete as really like what an order should look like to be enough to justify supervised visitation.
Yeah, but in a criminal proceeding, you've got a pretty clear set of guidelines of what you need to see, and it's comparable, sort of emotionally, at least for some of the parties, maybe all the parties. But but family court is a whole different ballgame in terms of evidence, and so it would be helpful to see what that should look like, because otherwise, I think sometimes the perception is that if I'm going to supervise parenting and continue it for any length of time, regardless of what I'm hearing, I really need to have very good reasons, and it would be better not to, for all of the reasons you've been describing. But when it comes time to carry that burden of proof, it's not always clear what's going to do it. And it's not a question of precedent. Maybe that's confined to Montana to some extent, but certainly any kind of example, one of those things would be helpful.
I would be happy to work with you some on that, and there was also a request to try to get more of this information into checklist format that custody and psych evaluators could use from another person here. And those are both projects I would really be happy to work on, because I think that would be very, very helpful to practitioners of all kinds to really break things down. The statutes do vary tremendously from state to state, and so we're not going to get something universally applicable. But part of this, again, continues to be a need to change what is considered common sense. because what I mean by that is, going back to my analogy of the drug dealer, if we were taking battering as seriously as we should, given what its actual social consequences are and given the actual number of people that are dying every year, we wouldn't be in quite the same battles. In fact, what I propose, and this is some people will consider this extreme, but I'll tell you what I propose. First of all, a protective mother currently faces what I call a double burden of proof. She has to prove to the court's satisfaction that the man is a batterer, that he has perpetrated a pattern of abuse, including violence towards her. And then, if she succeeds in meeting that burden of proof, she has to meet a further burden of proof for why he's unsafe for unsupervised contact and should have supervised contact. I would argue that it is appropriate that she be required to meet that first burden of proof. That's the way our whole civil system works. We can't avoid that in fairness to the father. But once she has met that burden of proof to the court's satisfaction that he is a perpetrator of a history of domestic violence, then I believe the second burden of proof should shift to him. And rather than it being on her to prove that he is unsafe for unsupervised contact, the burden of proof should shift to him to prove that he's safe for unsupervised contact. And that would be a very, very different way of operating. I don't think we're going to see that for a long time. But
Someone may, I'm sure, well, they know more about it than I do, but we had a statute at one point that established a rebuttable presumption along those lines. I don't think it was for supervision. And then the first Stoneman decision that's cited in the summary of Montana statutes also held that it was an error to permit unsupervised visits when there's, the level of use in that case is pretty severe. But those laws have been there, and I think in my first trial, actually, I had also my first experience of a statute being completely ignored. And I'm sure that was my fault, but it was on the books, it's there, the rebuttable presumption part, and certainly this case is there. But I think it's difficult to know what to do with that law once you have it. And then that same perception that, well, if we're going to continue supervision on into the future, that somehow seems like it's going to be very harmful.
so, yeah.
So you're changing the common sense, but what are you changing it to, or how are you supporting it?
So I'll talk in a few minutes about the structure of visitation. In general, in the states that I'm familiar with, the rebuttable presumption of custody not going to the batterer, it has to be invoked. But even when invoked, is often ignored. And so there's also a tremendous need for people to be available who are trained and able to do appellate work. I'll take one more question, and then I'm going to go on to some points because we just have sort of a natural segue here from what you just talked about into some of the other things I want to talk about, but we'll have other chances to do questions and comments.
You talked about profile of batterer. Is there a profile of a woman who enters a relationship where she comes back?
No. There's very little that's been able to be established about her except that she's female. She does have a somewhat higher rate, but not a dramatically higher rate, of coming from homes where her mother was battered. But that's not like a huge change. So there's still for so many battered women, that's not going to be true. And what the studies tend to indicate, even about the woman who does come from a home where her mom was battered, is that she does not appear to be more likely than other women to become involved with a battering man. She appears to, if she does become involved with a battering man, to stay in that relationship a longer period of time. So even that woman does not appear to, quote, choose an abuser. What that woman seems to do is feel less agency, less like she has any option or way to get out. I suspect much more likely to feel that it's her own fault because she grew up with her dad or stepdad constantly indoctrinating the message, inculcating the message that a female to whom this occurs is causing it herself and is therefore in certain ways more thoroughly trapped by that sense of powerlessness and by that indoctrination. There is a very small percentage of women, and it's small enough that it's not even been established in research, but I've just observed it anecdotally, of women who do seem to be involved over and over again with abusers. And that appears to be a woman who, first of all, has often been really severely abused in her own childhood, and secondly, a woman who never gets enough of a break between her relationships to ever heal from what's happened in the last. She's into the next one before she's ever had any chance to heal from what happened to her in the previous one. So one of the ways that we can really help battered women get in better relationships the next time is to try to help them get involved with no one for a while. That's very hard to do when you've just been battered. When you've just been battered, you are very, very eager to be involved in a new relationship because it makes you feel safer, and it also helps to counter some of the messages you've constantly given that you're ugly, you're useless, no one will ever want you, blah, you're terrible, blah, blah, blah. You tend to be dying to be quickly into another relationship to prove that you're okay, and also just to not be so scared when you're trying to sleep at night. And so one of the ways that we can help women is help them get through that time when it's so scary to be with no one, so that they have some time to heal from what just happened. Women who've had some chance to heal from what's just happened, I find, are actually less likely than other women, than women who've never been abused, to get involved with an abuser the next time. In other words, if you haven't learned from your experience, you're more vulnerable than other people. If you have learned from your experience, you're less vulnerable than other people. So one of the services we can most provide battered women is breathing time and time to heal from and think through and make sense out of. One thing that abusers do is set up an environment where you never get a chance. They maintain constant crisis. So you never get a chance to just even put your head together enough to figure out what's happening.
What about the effect that a new relationship that the abuser gets in might have on the level of violence that continues against the mother in the post-separation period?
When he's involved with somebody new.
How does that affect the outcome for this mom and kids?
I've observed a couple of things. I don't see anything I could really generalize about. Sometimes he actually fades away at that point. He becomes much more interested in the new relationship and actually becomes less of a problem. He sort of fades off. Other times he really enlists his new partner as part of a campaign. Starts having the children, he starts pressing for more and more and more time with the children, but we discover that he's actually having his new partner do most of the care of them during the time that he's getting all this expanded time with them. And then sometimes really gets her involved in hating his ex and saying terrible things about her, and she sort of gets drawn into the whole campaign. She starts to feel very bad for him because he's telling these stories about all these terrible things he was accused of that he never did, and so she can start to feel very hateful. She can start to feel terrible, bad feelings towards his ex because she's never heard the other side of the story. So that's what I've observed. So somebody over, yeah.
To what extent, if any, do you see economic need for, like going into a new relationship before, as you would describe it, you have time to heal because you have no other economic?
Thank you. The question is, to what extent do I see part of what drives a woman to get sort of maybe too quickly, in a sense, into a new relationship? Her economic desperation. Thank you. That's a very, very important factor for the woman who has children especially, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about women with children who are often just barely squeaking by. And someone to live with, to help pay the rent. Oh, it's really, really tempting. So many reasons why we have to get much, much stricter with abusers about making their child support payments, because the abuser is often able to use, I shouldn't say often, is sometimes able to use his failure to pay child support to his advantage in various ways. Because she's either driven to get back with him because she can't make it, or she gets involved with someone who's a little shady, and then he's able to go to the court and say she's involved with this shady person. Or he just has a much nicer home, so he starts to have a preference for custody. So we really have to look very carefully at those child support questions. Last one, and then I've really got to go on.
I was just going to make a comment about.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about, is there a profile for women that get into these relationships, and just on the other end of that, I have a lot of colleagues have told me that have worked with violent men about their innate ability to seek out women who kind of hesitate to be involved in that type of
And so sometimes I say to when a woman says, oh, I've gotten involved with another abuser, I must be attracted to abusers, I say, well, not necessarily. Maybe that an abuser is attracted to you. And because of their power orientation, some abusers really want to move in on a woman who's in a vulnerable position. So if she's just coming off a relationship where she was abused, he knows he's going to look great by comparison. If she's got a substance abuse problem and he can move in and be the one that helps her get sober, that's going to put him in a great position. We cannot assume, by the way, this is one of the mistaken assumptions that gets made, though, that this is true about all abusers, that they always seek out and are attracted to vulnerability. That's not always true. There are abusers who are really attracted to tough, successful, strong women. So we need to be aware that that can happen also. So I've had people say that they really want to make sure that we're spending more time. We started it, but that we spend more time on nuts and bolts of custody assessment things. So I want to make sure that we spend another good chunk of time on that, and then have some more time for questions or more time for doing another exercise if we can. So I talked about a list of about 12 factors. I think I have them listed as 13 in the batter's parent that we would want to look at in spectrum risk. And now I'm going to talk about this post-separation issue in a slightly different way to get at some of the same issues, which is to talk about, well, why do we need to put him on a spectrum of risk? What are the post-separation risks? Why do we have to go through evaluating whether he's escalating, evaluating how severely controlling he is? Remember all the things I said we needed to evaluate: his substance abuse history, whether he's involved the children in the abuse before. So why? Why do we need to look through all those things? What are the post-separation risks? So first of all, the risk of abduction. According to the research, it's not domestic violence research, it's parental abduction research, found that a majority of parental abductions happen in a context of where there's a history, happen in the presence of a history of domestic violence, and a majority of that majority, are carried out by the abuser or his agent. The risk of homicide. Homicides tend to happen post-separation or during and post-separation. That's when domestic violence homicides overwhelmingly take place. So it's a really, really volatile time. And we have homicides that take place in the midst of custody disputes. Probably the most famous one in this country was the chief of police of Tacoma, Washington, Chief Brame, who killed his wife in a parking lot with his children not far away after she had left him and while they were in the midst of custody. So there's risk of homicide. There's the risk of stalking, that there are batters who are really quite terrifying to their families post-separation, with drive-bys, following them in traffic, appearing places, doing damage to the home. Case that I was involved with and that I read all the custody, there were 12 custody evaluator reports on this case, written all by the same custody evaluator, case in Massachusetts, where the woman fled to shelter. The judge, the custody evaluator said that she'd had no reason to be afraid of this man. I read the report. There was no assessment of his dangerousness. So how could the evaluator know that she had no reason to be afraid of this man? Based on that evaluation, the judge ordered her back into the family home and ordered him out. She said, I don't want to live in the family home. It's a place I feel too vulnerable to him. The judge said, you are to live there or I'm taking custody of these children away from you. So she moved back into the home. They were then out of the home for a couple days on a vacation. She came home and found the house completely trashed. Things damaged, tossed all over the house. Some signature things done, which is one of the things that abusers do. Well, they'll damage things where only he would have known the significance of that object. Because he doesn't want it to be provable that it was him, but he wants them to know that it was him. She then fled the house with her children again, and so the judge switched custody to Dad, because she had violated the judge's order. And I wouldn't believe this if I hadn't followed the whole case and read I was a legal consultant on the case, read all the evaluators' reports and so forth. So the stalking can create a situation where the children are in more fear and distress potentially even than they were in when the family was together. This was clearly true in this case, that the children were more frightened post-separation than they had been. The litigation in itself becomes very, very stressful for mom and therefore is unhealthy for children. And it also uses up all these financial resources that could have gone to the children's musical lessons and sports teams and clubs and college. So it in itself becomes a form of abuse. And so that's one of the things that we have to be concerned about with domestic violence, is that he's going to use the litigation as a weapon of abuse and control. We started looking at some of the ways that abusers damage mother-child relationships, and they continue, some abusers continue post-separation to turn children more and more thoroughly against their mothers. Very often these are the same abusers who are accusing the mothers of being parental alienators. And batters are great projectors, but sometimes it's even more strategic than something that I would call projection. We know from the, now, from the point of view of arguing for supervised visitation, this is the kind of thing that gets very, very tricky. And I don't know the solution to it. You're going to say to a judge, this guy has a long history of trying to damage these children's relationship with their mother. We have indications that he's continuing to do so. So we believe his visits should be supervised. Now, how a judge is going to tend to respond to that is to say, you're not telling me about physical risk to these children. You're not saying he beats the children. You're not telling me about sexual risk to the children. You're not saying that he's a sexual abuser. You're telling me that he tries to turn the children against their mom. Well, that's a chronic problem in divorce of parents speaking badly to the children about the other parent, which it is. Although it's not true that all parents do it. That's one of the myths, but it is a very widespread problem. And so on this basis, you're going to tell me that these children's visits should be supervised? And so what we have to, I really think what we have to do is to try to put the research before the judges and put the research before the judges that show that children can be terribly wounded. That's very well established in the research by now, that children can be seriously psychologically wounded from their exposure to domestic violence, and that their chances of recovery depend above all on the quality of their relationship with their mother. And so if we are permitting, this isn't just any divorce. When people start saying, well, this happens in all divorces, we need to say, maybe it does, but it's also happening in this one. And this one happens to be a domestic violence related divorce with children who are potentially traumatized by the violence that they've witnessed. And in this particular kind of case, a batterer who's continuing to do damage to mother-child relationships is probably more psychologically dangerous to his children than any other batterer except the one who is beating or sexually abusing his children. And that this actually is one of the most central issues in a domestic violence-related divorce. That's going to be considered a novel argument. And I don't think it's going to carry a lot of weight right away. However, I think we need to make novel arguments because novel arguments down the year, after a period of years, stop being novel arguments. When judges start to hear an argument that they've heard 10 times before, it starts to carry a different kind of weight. Parental alienation, which is a very unfortunate theory that I won't really go into today, I don't think. Are you getting a lot of parental alienation cases? Parental alienation is on very, very shaky ground scientifically. Parental alienation, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but parental alienation is a theory that says that when children are reporting being abused by a parent, or when they are reporting that one parent abuses the other parent, that there's a good likelihood that what this is really about is one parent's desire to alienate these children from the other parent. Now, there are a lot of parents who are out to destroy children's relationship with the other parent. There's no question about it. That's not what we're talking about when I talk about the term parental alienation or parental alienation syndrome as it is used as an argument in court. When I'm talking about parental alienation as it has come to be used, I mean claim that that often can account for children's reports of being abused or of witnessing abuse. And there is no scientific basis for the claim that that's often a cause for children's reports of suffering or witnessing abuse. Certainly, parental campaigns to destroy children's relationship with the other parent, they're definitely out there. Anyone who denies that they happen, that's not what I'm denying. I'm denying their link to abuse allegations. And in fact, one of the people that we know are often out to destroy children's relationship with the other parent is men who batter. I'm not saying they all, again, but it's quite a common behavior in litigation. There's the physical risk to the mother during exchanges and at other times. Typically, that's the only risk I notice the court being aware of. I'm going down a long list of post-separation risks. This one is usually the only one that's being in any way looked at, and it's only one of so many. And I find typically not even the top concern that the mother has. Okay, there's the issue of children being physically, sexually, or psychologically abused by the abuser. I gave you the statistics on the very high overlap between batterers and child abuse. There's also the issue of children being re-traumatized. When a battered woman comes to court saying the children are coming home saying that their father yells at them, the court is going to tend to say, well, parents yell at children sometimes. That's going to happen. That's unfortunate, but I'm sure you yell at the children sometimes too. And that's true. But what we're having to deal with here is that the impact on children is different when they've witnessed this man's violence. The meaning now to them, the psychological impact on them of being yelled at by him is not the same as when they're yelled at by a parent who they never saw beat up the other parent, or terrorize the other parent, or hold a gun to the other parent, or whatever it may be in this particular case. So we really have to take seriously the issue of behaviors that may not normally be on the charge, but in a domestic violence case are potentially re-traumatizing. And the thing is that we see the re-traumatizing impact. We see these incidents where children come home from a weekend with their battering dad describing that they were not necessarily beaten, but that scary things happened, and then school personnel are telling us that suddenly this child whose attention had finally gotten good in class has suddenly, their attention has gone to pieces again, and they didn't learn anything that week. Or the children who after 3 years of struggling trying to get out of diapers is finally out of them, come home from the visit with the battering dad, and they're back in the diapers again. We have to take these re-traumatization issues seriously. We also get a lot of reports of neglectful, irresponsible, inconsistent parenting by men who batter. That again has to be taken seriously because of these children's particular psychological vulnerability. It also has to be taken seriously because this is one of the ways that he destroys mother-child relationships, is by making his home a place where there's no structure, there's no rules. You can be on the computer as much as you want, you can eat junk as much as you want, you can stay up till all hours of the night. If you're a teenager, you can come home just tanked where everybody can see it a mile away, but dad just seems to not notice how drunk you are. These are all from my cases. Neglectful parenting matters, and it has particular implications in a domestic violence case. Batters batter serially. They don't necessarily batter in every relationship, but there's considerable evidence, including research, that they batter serially. So there's the risk that that children are going to be exposed. I had a case actually where I was the guardian ad litem, where not only was the father abusing the new mother, but he was already starting to involve the children in his abuse of the new partner. He had involved one of his children. He had admitted it to me. He thought it was funny. When he was in a rage at his new wife, he had involved his son from the previous relationship, who was over for visitation, in grabbing all of her personal belongings and throwing them out into the driveway. So here's a boy already being drawn into the fabric of the abuse towards the new wife.
Is there any research on the percentage of
No.
batters?
No. These are, as I was saying, who get involved, who are going to batter the next woman that they're involved with?
Yeah, or who have battered a series of women. Is there any?
Oh, yes, there is research. 60% and up, yeah, have battering in multiple relationships. There are other studies that show higher than that. My clinical experience is that they batter in every relationship that gets really long-term and serious. That the relationships in which they're not particularly abusive or violent are relationships that are fairly short in duration, or relationships that are happening during a campaign period, such as a time when he's trying to escape criminal charges or a time when he's involved in custody litigation. Now, another really key point that I find missing from every custody evaluation I've ever read. Sons of batterers have dramatically higher rates established by multiple studies of growing up to become domestic violence perpetrators themselves. One of the primary, there are many transmission points, but one of the top transmission points for domestic violence perpetration is father or stepfather to son. In other words, boys who witness domestic violence. Two of the studies specifically looked at what's the transmission method. In other words, what is it about having a battering dad or stepdad that leads you to have so much higher risk of growing up to become a batterer yourself? And both of those studies found that it was the way the boy learned his father's values and attitudes. One of the studies specifically compared boys that were more traumatized by the violence that they had witnessed to boys that were less traumatized by the violence that they had witnessed, and found that they had about equal rates of growing up to become batterers themselves. In other words, it isn't the trauma The trauma creates all kinds of other problems. But it isn't the trauma that determines which boys are going to follow in dad or stepdad's footsteps. It's the extent to which they're taking on his mentality. When we give children a really extensive program of unsupervised contact with their battering dads, we are essentially ensuring, if he's not dealing with his issues, that they are going to take on dad's key ways of thinking. And that's a key way that we're contributing to domestic violence in the next generation. It means we have to be extra concerned with children who are coming home from their visits with dad, making comments about things that dad is saying that are negative about females, or that are justifying of violence, or that are negative about mom, or that say that mom lied about the violence. These, again, are all things from my cases. I had a case with the first case, if I remember right, that I was ever guardian ad litem on. The mother's relationship with her 8-year-old son had completely deteriorated. It was a mess by the time I was involved with the case. And it turned out that this father had spent almost a year in jail for strangling the mom. And it turned out that when he got out of jail, he started talking to his older boy in a lot of detail about what jail was like, in a way that was incredibly disturbing to the boy, and telling the boy that it was because his mother had lied to the police and said that he had attacked her when he had hit her when he hadn't. The boy, by the way, had witnessed the assault, according to the police report, about 4 years earlier, but by this time couldn't remember it anymore. Probably too traumatic to remember, is my guess. But I had it in the arresting officer's report that the boy had been present during the assault. The arresting officer also described in his report what the marks had been like to mom's neck and so forth. And so abusers have a tremendous power, if they choose to go that way, as some do, to really indoctrinate children into these ways that we're really going to get them to hate their mom, and that are really going to lure the boy into the abuser mentality and the abuser way of operating. Very, very serious concern that I have never yet seen be a factor in a decision about whether an abuser should have unsupervised visitation or not. And yet again, back to the drug dealer analogy, if we saw any signs that this drug dealer parent was starting to give certain messages to the child that drug use or drug dealing was okay, I assume we'd be pulling unsupervised visits really fast with that person. So, I don't think I'm going to talk about the whole, I don't know, are people particularly interested in the aligning with the batterer issue? Is that something that, because I feel like we're covering so much detail here. Is this the last slide, I hope? Yes, okay. So a couple points here. We're starting to have studies in the last few years that focus more on children's resilience and children's recovery from exposure to battering. The earlier studies were looking at their injuries. And we're starting to see some evidence of considerable ability for children to heal, particularly if they're kept safe from unsupervised contact with the batterer post-separation, or if the batterer's being reasonably safe parent post-separation and the relationship with him is going okay. I get cases where the batterer chases repeated therapists off the case through threatening lawsuit or through just becoming a miserable, unpleasant person. There's a healing opportunity for the child, just went down the drain. There are increasingly now, usually through the battered women's programs, groups available specifically for children who've witnessed domestic violence. The outcome research on these groups is good. And I know from clinical and case experience that they can be exceptionally effective. And yet the batterer sometimes goes straight to the court if he finds out that children are involved in services that are specifically domestic violence related, and says the court's going to convince, this group, is going to convince these children that I'm a batterer and that I'm a terrible person and they shouldn't be in, and then children end up being denied access to one of the best services they could have. Do you have in this area any group work available for children of battered women?
Yes.
Yeah, where, through what? Through the Y. So it's a great service, and we want to make sure that the abuser is not able to sabotage. I don't believe they're going to turn children against their father. If you see any indication of the group doing that, you should look into it. But I've studied so many different curriculums that have been designed for working with children of battered women. They all would acknowledge actually that it was bad for children to work on turning them against their father. What the father sometimes perceives as the group turning children against them is that the group does tend to help the children learn certain language about what you call different kinds of abusive behaviors, and also learn that they're wrong, and also learn that they're not the fault of the victim or the fault of the children, that they are 100% the responsibility of the person who does them.
Just turned off your microphone.
I did?
Yeah, or somebody.
I did not. It went off. Hello? Hello. The battery might be gone, or maybe. Well, here, maybe. No, this little window here doesn't seem to want to let me in.
That's the St. Pat's mic, so I don't know if we can fix that or not.
I can change the battery and you can see.
But I think those are the same thing.
Well, maybe I'm going to have to just really scream. Oh, you know what? Maybe I should just go to the podium. I hate podiums, but maybe that's where I ought to be.
Let me see if I can just change this.
Okay. Is this, yeah, this one's on. Ooh, that sounds nice. Maybe I should have been here all along. Wow, I'd have much more of a voice left if I had just stayed here today. So, what's that? Already?
It should work now if you want to try it.
Let's try it. Is it? Are we back on?
Yeah, you gotta turn it on.
See, I can't figure out how to even get in there. It won't let me in. So the
Battery died. Let's take a shot.
I believe that, and this may seem like a tangent, but it'll connect in just a minute. I believe that although parenting children is an unbelievably complicated project, probably the most complicated project that any of us undertakes, in certain ways we can reduce what we have to do to 2 points above all. We have to make sure that our children get enough love and nurturing and affection, caretaking, and we have to make sure that they learn to take responsibility for their actions. Gradually. I mean, they don't have to learn it when they're 2, but even when they're 2, the process is beginning. And by the time they're 18, they're supposed to be ready to be completely responsible for their actions because we're trying to keep them out of jail. And so the presence of an abuser in the home undermines in various ways both of those projects. But I want to just point out specifically the way it undermines the project of helping children learn to be responsible for their own actions. Because when you have an abuser in the home, children hear the batterer making all kinds of excuses. They hear him blaming the mother. They hear him blaming the children. And they learn specifically from him, and actually this is what these studies show about boys who are growing up in these environments, that they learn specifically that they are not responsible for their own actions, particularly if they're male, that they in fact get to blame other people for the violence they do to them. In particular, they get to blame females for the violence that they do to them. And so one of the most important things that happens in group work with children of battered women is that you go into the question, who's responsible for abuse and who's responsible for violence? And the answer may seem very simple, which is the person that's doing it, not the person to whom it is done. But that's not a simple matter for children who've been exposed to battering. It's huge. It's huge. And how they resolve that question has lifelong implications. If they resolve that question by deciding that mom is responsible for the violence that's been done to her, then the research tells us, and I would argue common sense tells us, they're at a much greater likelihood to grow up to become perpetrators or victims of domestic violence themselves. Whereas if they grow up believing that you're responsible for your own actions, I think they have much better chances of staying out of both perpetration and victimization. However, if they start to put together that the abuser is responsible for his own actions, in his sort of self-centered way of framing what's going on, what he's going to say is that that group is turning his children against him. That's how he's going to frame what's going on there. So we need to be aware of how that happens and run interference, not let abusers sabotage children's potential for healing. That's a tragic, here these children have already been ripped off in a very profound way from their childhood, from having had to witness this really scary and demeaning and painful violence in their own home. And now we're going to rip them off again by taking away from them their chances to heal. That's an outrage on top of an outrage. So we need to make sure that doesn't occur. And we need to be alert for ways that he may be continuing to drive wedges between siblings and keep that from happening. And occasionally, I don't run into this a lot, but occasionally I run into situations where visitation or custody and visitation orders are being written in ways that are really going to be damaging to children's relationships with each other. So we need to make sure that that's being factored in to how we're structuring custody and visitation. I have a whole set of recommendations about, oh boy, there's so much that people were hoping we could do, and we can never do that much in a day, but the,
Microphone.
yeah, I'll be back there in just a moment. Thank you. We really don't realistically have time today for me to go step by step through talking about how you assess what are real indicators of change in men who batter. It's discussed extensively in Why Does He Do That, and it's discussed extensively in The Batterer as Parent. You have my complete permission to Xerox stuff from any of those books as much as you want, so you're not under, because I don't want to put you under any pressure to buy my books. Don't tell the publisher that I'm telling you this, but I'm telling you Xerox freely from sections. But a couple points that I want to undermine, I've talked so much about undermining today that I'm undermining on the brain, that I want to underline is that many of the same principles of change that we would apply again to the other problems that I was comparing to, substance abuse, sexual offending, apply to domestic violence, and I don't know why we would expect otherwise. So, for example, batterers don't change if they don't agree that they had a problem to begin with. I can just tell you this from my clinical experience. They don't change if they're still denying the lion's share of the violence that they've done. They don't change if they're continuing to blame the woman for most of what they've done. In addition, in order to change, they have to be able to identify what their patterns of coercive behavior were, not just the violence, but what the whole fabric was of domineering, oppressive, bullying behavior. And he's got to be able to identify what his attitudes were that were driving that. His beliefs that she should obey, his beliefs that she was less than him, his beliefs that she owes him sex. I mean, I lay out in my work a lot of the different key attitudinal underpinnings of the behavior of men who batter. And he's got to agree to change those. And then we have to see some steps. We have to see some evidence of internal struggle. I'll give you an example from batterer counseling. I have clients who are extremely defensive, who are just hostile. You don't know what you're talking about. This program is BS. This is a waste of time. I don't belong here. Blah, blah, blah. You guys hate men. Women run the world. Which, of course, I should send him right out for assessment for paranoia, because I don't understand how you would decide that women run the world. And then I have a middle ground of clients who are pretty defensive, but not so defensive that nothing can get through, and then nothing, we can have productive struggle. And then I have clients who are very, very open, who take criticism really, really well, who are able to articulate a lot of what they're learning and say it back to me, who often are quite critical of other guys in the group about things that they're saying and doing. Which of those groups do you think I see the greatest change in? Okay, anybody have a guess on that? What? It's the middle. It's the middle. Of course, when I was a new and younger young and naive counselor, and I don't want to suggest that those two terms are synonymous, just that in my case they were. Those super compliant, I'm seeing the light, you're making me look at things about myself that I've been running away from for years. If it weren't for you, I'd be back in jail. Oh boy, I used to love those guys. I used to just eat it up. But gradually I had to face the fact that they didn't go anywhere. They didn't go any more than the hyper-defensive, you're a total jerk, you don't know what you're talking about, I hate women kind of client. And the guys in the middle ground were the ones that had the best potential to actually make some progress. Why? Because they were being defensive enough that they were being real. I can't get anywhere with a guy who's not being real. But they weren't being so defensive that nothing could get through. So we have to see some signs of struggle, some signs that the guy has been uncomfortable, that he's been grappling with things, that there's movement over time. So that's really all I can say, unfortunately, just because the clock is ticking about change. But there are meaningful indicators of change, most of which are never applied, in my experience, in suddenly declaring that a guy's not like that anymore. Most batterer programs, by the way, are not equipped to write assessments that will tell you whether he's been progressing in these areas or not. I have no idea what batterer programs are like around here, but I think what I believe family courts need to do is they actually need
to stop relying on the batterer program to tell them what they need, and the family court needs to tell the batterer program what it needs. We want you to tell us how he's doing on these 10 measures. Now, you may think, what, the family court knows more than the batterer program about how to tell whether he's really changing? Well, it depends on the batterer program, but most batterer programs get really vague. And honestly, I did this when I was a new batterer counselor. We didn't know any better. We would write reports that said he had a really good attitude, he's a really good group participant, very involved in group discussions, really seems to be taking a look at himself. Unfortunately, it took a gradually realized you can do all those things and go nowhere. And that's why I've broken it up along all these other lines that I just took you through, which I believe are the much more meaningful indicators. Ultimately, one of the things that most needs to happen is that if he is having contact with the mother, and in most of the cases, unless there's a complete no contact order, they still are having some discussions on the phone about the children or about the visitation schedule or about financial matters, she should be noticing a difference. If she's saying there's no change in how he treats me, we should be really skeptical of his claims to have dealt with his issues. Yeah?
What percentages of people are in that middle ground?
Well, now, I'm not saying that everybody who's in that middle ground makes substantial changes. I'm saying that the people who are in that middle ground are the ones where I see the best chance, where I do see the ones that do change come out of. And, you know, those groups roughly, in my experience, were in about thirds. The middle group was a little bigger, a little more than a third, and the outline groups were a little less than a third. But, you know, what percentage make really lasting changes is much smaller because they have to be willing to continue in that struggle for a long period of time. Again, think about the sexual offender, think about the substance abuser. We expect people to be in a process and a struggle usually for at least some period of years. And we expect a batterer to be in a batterer program for 16 weeks or 26 weeks. But I find the ones who are willing to stay in an honest struggle for a long period of time, they often make some really substantial changes even by the woman's report. So it's not that they can't do it. It's that we as a society still don't require them to be in programs nearly long enough, and we don't require them to be doing serious work while they're there. If the probation officer says, well, you got to go do your 40 meetings, that's not going to work. I'm talking now about in the criminal arena. The probation officer has to say, you have to do your 40 meetings, and here's the piece of work, here's the pieces of work you have to be doing while you're there. So I don't want to talk about these things in detail. I think we've talked about them enough. These are steps that are generally going to lead to either the mother capitulating, which is not going to be the best for the children in the long run, or going to keep the case coming back and back and back and back into court. Sorry, I'm having to go back and forth between the... Oh, is this thing on a long enough leash that... Jeez. The things I never think of. So what do we want to move to? I've given you a lot of steps in doing proper custody assessment. By the way, there are versions of that of the custody assessment that are free on my website, which is lundybancroft.com. So you don't even have to get the Chapter 7 of the batterer's parent because there are 2 or 3 versions of that free on my website, sort of slightly different versions that emphasize slightly different points with some considerable overlap. So what do I believe ends up really being best for children and will actually help cases be in court less rather than in court more? Creating really strict visitation conditions for the abuser and then holding him to those. If after doing our assessment we find him in the higher risk category, his visits should be supervised not for 6 months, not for a year, not for 2 years, not for 5 years. They should be supervised until we see indications that he's dealing with his issues. One thing that I disagree with many judges about is I hear judges say, well, we can't supervise his visits forever. And my response to that is, oh, yes, we can. And in fact, we ought to supervise his visits until he shows us that he's done the work. And if he never shows us that he's done the work, then yes, his visits should be supervised for good. And I see so many times in my case practice, children's psychological deterioration as their unsupervised contact with the abuser begins. And it's also been written about some in the literature, in the little bit of post-separation literature that there is. Yes, it's going to be best for children if they can have a good relationship with their battering dad. There's no question about it. It's not going to, if he's in the sort of medium or high risk category, that relationship is not going to be good for them unless he really deals with his issues. If he's in the low risk category, they may be able to actually benefit from having quite a relationship with him, even if he doesn't really deal with his issues. In other words, if he comes in the category that really doesn't have a history of trying to destroy their relationship with mom, has not been violent to them in front of her, was not violent towards her during pregnancy, seems to really accept that the relationship has ended, doesn't seem to be on a campaign against mom, those are also the kinds of cases that are least likely to be litigated. Most of those cases are actually already decided out of court and you're never going to see them. But some of those cases will be litigated and you'll decide this is a guy who probably is a good bet for unsupervised visitation. But the guy who's in the medium risk, high risk category, his visits need to be supervised until he's dealt with his issues. Or maybe not supervised. Maybe he, I recommend a range of ways of thinking about this. With some guys, for example, you will not really feel his visits need to be supervised, but you feel that because he's such a terrible influence on his children, their values and attitudes, that his visits need to be kept short. They need to not go overnight. Younger children don't do well when they go overnight in a domestic violence case because they get very insecure. They're carrying these traumatic memories, and they need to be with mom overnight, and they need to be in their own bed above all overnight, perhaps even more important than whether they're with mom. And they need to, the most important thing for them, because of the trauma they carry, is they need to know that they can get to mom. So it's very scary for them, the awareness that, oh my God, I can't see her till tomorrow, even if I really want to. One thing that I've proposed to judges, I haven't seen this used yet, in cases where you're kind of in a middle ground and you're not quite sure which way to go with this case, it's sort of like maybe it's a supervision case and maybe it's unsupervised and you're feeling like it's right in that mid zone, I say, okay, then give them unsupervised visits with the rule that any time they are asked, they ask to be taken to mom, they have to be immediately delivered home. You may say, oh, well, that gives children too much power. Well, compared to supervised visitation, is that? I mean, he's getting the dad's getting a lot more freedom than he would with supervised visitation if he has to deliver them home on demand. And because I think children, for one thing, it's so critical to their recovery is that they need to feel secure. And in order to feel secure, they need to know that they can get to mom when they need to get to her. At least by telephone, but even to be home with her, particularly if they're younger children, they need to be able to get home with her if they need to get home with her. Certainly the battered mom sometimes is contributing to the escalation of the problem. Obviously there are going to be some dynamics in a case like this. We don't help her de-escalate by telling her to settle down. That just is another way that she feels invalidated and gets more frightened for whether her children are going to be okay. If you want to help the woman calm down and stop contributing her end to the escalation of this tension, take her concerns seriously. Show that you're willing to address them. Structure visitation in a way that addresses them. When she comes with reports that they're coming home upset or freaked out from their visits, do something about it. And if she finds that her concerns are being taken seriously, very often then tension levels are going to start to go down. His behavior also is going to improve, which is another reason why tension levels are going to go down. When batterers find that they're being monitored, really monitored, their behavior tends to improve at least somewhat. Set a review date rather than waiting for the parties to bring it back in. Say, I want to see you again in 3 months if it needs to be seen that soon, or if it doesn't, I want to see you again in 6 months. To check with whether the parents, particularly the abuser, is complying with the court orders. Encourage the battered woman to use battered women's services. Encourage services for children who've witnessed, and encourage the use of the battered program or require the use of the battered program by the batterer. Do not require services for victims, recommend them. Require services for perpetrators. Look for ways, if matters are actually going on in separate courts, and I don't know how much that happens around here, but to the extent that matters are going on in separate courts, one of the things that we need to do is improve communication with courts. Batterers get away with more when the criminal court doesn't know what's happening in the family law proceeding, the family law doesn't know what's happening in the criminal proceeding, and then sometimes there's matters in a juvenile court. And you can have all these different proceedings. I've sat in court while batterers lied to the judge, and I knew the facts because of my involvement in the case about what the other court had done. So they're not afraid to lie right to a judge's face about this other court's actions. And so it's very important for judges to have. Now, I don't know what to do about that because then we have the whole problem of, well, does this then become ex parte communication? And I think we have to develop some systems for how that's going to be solved. But the intercourt communication has got to improve. One way is to form a dedicated domestic violence court that is then handling all the matters. The criminal matters, the juvenile matters, and the family law matters all under one roof. And sometimes there's not good communication with child protection either. Batters should have to pay for supervised visitation if the visit's being supervised because of the batter's conduct. I've, again, watched in court while a woman gets told, well, you should help pay for this. You're the one that wants the supervision. But what? She's not asking for supervision like for a vacation in Cancun. She's asking for the supervision because she thinks it's what's necessary for her children's safety because he has behavioral problems. When we require her to help pay for them, not only is that unfair to her, it also sends a very, very bad message to the abuser that once again, he is not going to have to be fully responsible for the impacts of his actions. To the extent that he's able to pay, to the extent that there's a significant difference in economic position between the abuser and the mom, we want to make him start paying percentages or all of her legal fees. You want to see these things drop out of court fast? Start making the abuser really pay based on really pay her fees. I'm not saying in a punitive way, I'm not saying if he can't do it, but I'm saying requiring him to pay her legal fees genuinely to the extent that he could. You'll get rid of these cases in a hurry because batters tend to be very, very focused on money. Batters who say they care so deeply about their children, as soon as it starts to cost them too much, sometimes just vanish. That's not always true, but it's sometimes true. Watch about the use of frequent frivolous court dates. When you've got a domestic violence case or you're pretty convinced it's a domestic violence case and he's bringing it in over and over and over again, you're going to have to... I know this is a dilemma for courts because courts very understandably want to make sure that the door is open. They want to be accessible. They want people to be able to bring their concerns. And I'm sympathetic to that. On the other hand, what happens in a domestic violence case is if his access is too free, that he starts to use the legal system in itself as a form of abuse. He can cause her to lose jobs. He can cause her to lose housing because of what she's having to spend on her litigation. It's not at all uncommon for me to talk to women who tell me that they have spent between $100,000 and $200,000 over the course of their litigation with a batterer for custody and visitation. And also it's time away from her children when she's having to go to court. So we need to put some limitation on his ability to be constantly dragging her back into court. And these issues, the other issues that are the last ones here, I've already talked about. So we have time for a couple more questions and the day is over. I promised you one more exercise this afternoon, which we simply didn't do, and I apologize for that, but I ended up, I was trying to, at one point I said I'm talking too much, and several people in the audience shook their head no, that wasn't true. And I took them at their word and decided that it was better to cover the material. And I hope the rest of you have managed to get, this is a tough thing because some people have very, very different learning styles. We all have different learning styles. And some people to have to listen to as much as you had to listen to today is impossible. And I apologize to you if you're in that group. Because in a typical training of mine, we do a lot more hands-on and exercise kind of work during the course of the day. Whereas today we did largely just piles of material. But we have about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah. Yeah, so the investigative process, and I also could send you, you know what, I should get this up on my website, because I've drafted a guide to what are the steps that I believe a custody evaluator should properly take, not from the point of view of these other steps that I describe in assessing risk, but like what are actually the sources that need to be considered. And I could put that up on my website as well. But some of the things I already talked about, medical records and medical personnel, school records and school personnel.
Whose school records are you talking about?
The children's. The children's medical records and medical personnel. Whether mom's going to provide medical records with respect to domestic violence, that's up to her. School records and school personnel. Past partners of the parents, particularly past partners of the alleged abuser. In quite a number of my cases, half of my cases, I'd say, I located previous partners who were willing to describe having been physically abused by this man. So his claims that he was being falsely accused became quite a bit weaker when I found a previous partner that doesn't prove, but it certainly weakens his claim that the allegations are false when I find a previous woman that he's abused. One case, the man said, I'm on great. I said, do you keep in touch? I don't tell him that I'm going to contact their exes because that wouldn't work at all. He would immediately have brain damage and not be able to remember where any of them were. But I say, are you in good terms or do you keep in touch with any of your exes? And this one guy said, oh yeah, in fact, woman I was with for years, we're really good friends. She and my mother are really close. They talk all the time. So I called his mother and I said, he says that you're still in touch with an ex of his. And she said, yeah. And I said, could you put me in touch with her? She gave me her number. I called her up. I said, I'm dealing with, a custody evaluation, and there's allegations of violence, and I want to know if there were any issues of violence in your relationship. Yeah, he punched me in the face and chipped my tooth, and I have a permanently chipped tooth ever since. And yes, I do keep in contact with his mother. His mother's lovely. He's not so lovely. I'm paraphrasing. Neighbors, work colleagues, friends and relatives. Now, I've argued quite recently with a custody evaluator saying, well, the people that he provides are going to say good things about him, and the people that she provides are going to say good things about her, so what's the point? Well, you still end up learning some really interesting things. People let slip things that are quite worrisome, or people end up contradicting things that you're hearing, or people were directly present when important things happened and saw them with their own eyes, which becomes important. I already talked about the importance of testing credibility, of just going to certain sources, whatever they may be, to try to see if they indicate something to me in general about what this person's patterns of truthfulness are in talking to me. Police records, whether they made an arrest or not, there can be very important things in reports written by police and police personnel. In some cases, the police really get what's going on in this family in a way that nobody else does. I've run into cases like that. Child protective records and child protective personnel, and any other proceedings that are happening in other courts. Then another thing that I find is very useful to look into, if there are previous protective orders on the case, is to read the underlying affidavit. Now, I assume in Montana, like anywhere else, a woman has to write an affidavit in order to apply for a protective order. And there's often very interesting and revealing information in the affidavit that she wrote to request a protective order. It could include things like, the underlying affidavit may be exceedingly vague, which would tell us something useful. If she's saying he abused me, but she can't seem to come up with any descriptions or any details. Versus an affidavit that says, here's some of what he's done. I've had situations where the alleged abuser said she invented these domestic violence allegations to use as a weapon in the divorce. And I found an affidavit that she wrote to get a protective order 5 years earlier, back when they were still together, that described violence in detail. Does that prove that it's true? No. But it does prove that it didn't just come up now as a divorce tactic. That matter, at least, has been resolved. I had a guy tell me that she's accused other partners of domestic violence, that that's just something routinely she does, and that she accused her ex-husband of domestic violence that she has children with. I called her ex-husband. Her ex-husband did not have lovely things to say about her. But he did say, no, that's totally false that she ever accused me of domestic violence. She never did. He said, she did actually once take a restraining order out against me under pressure from her new boyfriend to do so. This is the guy who... but she and I get along fine. And they did. They had a pretty decent... She and her ex-husband had a pretty decent relationship. So those are some examples of some of the places where I go and where I end up learning things. See, now I don't do evaluations anymore either, but during the period that I was doing evaluations, my goal was that when the time came for me to write the report, which usually meant it was due the next day, I did not want to be in a position of having to decide which parent I found more believable. Now, I had maybe twice when I did have to write my report on the basis of which parent I found more believable. But I hated that because it's so easy to be wrong, making a decision on that basis. I didn't want to be there. And so the vast majority of the time, I was able to get enough information that by the time I was writing my report, I didn't have to rely on that. And I would much, much rather be there. And I believe a judge feels the same way. A judge would much rather not have to decide. Well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of judges that I talk to would much rather not be in a position of having to just decide which party they find more believable. They would much rather have facts before them. So, by the way, this question came up when I was saying that judges don't want to be told what to think, but they want a lot of facts. And the question was I contradicting myself? And what I wanted to explain was that judges don't want to be told what to conclude from those facts. Judges don't want to be, in my experience, judges don't want to be told, therefore he is a batterer, for example. But a judge is happy to know, here's the allegations about violence, here's who says they saw those, here's the indications, here's here's what works or doesn't work about the stories that people are telling. I had an alleged abuser tell me that she was totally inventing the allegations of violence, and that he had hurt her finger accidentally because when she opened the window to yell for help, he had slammed the window down and accidentally caught her finger in the process. And I said, if she had nothing to be afraid of and you weren't really assaulting her, why was she opening the window to scream for help? And above all, even more important than that, why were you so determined to close that window quickly so she couldn't do that? So when you know what to ask, you often find out very interesting things from the parties themselves, but only if you're a somewhat aggressive questioner of things. I had a client who said, she is inventing abuse, she has no evidence, this is disgusting, he was just so outraged that she would be doing this. And I said, well, did you ever actually get in a physical fight or hurt her in any way physically? Well, I shoved her. Well, like what kind of shove? Oh, like pushing her down on the bed or something. Oh, how many times did that happen? Oh, I don't know. A dozen, something like that. Any other time that you got in any physical contact with her in a fight? Well, one other time. I raised up my fist like this, my knee like this, not meaning to knee her, but just to scare her. And she had to lean forward right as I did that, and it caught her in the pelvis, so she got this black and blue in the pelvis. So he had just admitted to me to 13 acts of violence. The same guy who was just disgusted that she would accuse him of abuse with no basis for it. But the thing is that most evaluators would never, once he said she's totally falsely accusing me of abuse, would actually never gotten around to asking, well, but actually, was there ever any physical contact? Most people would never have found that out. It was only because I had a background in domestic violence that I even started to ask those questions. So we can find out really, really significant, we're out of time, but there's lots of other stories I'd love to tell you about things that I found out from the parties themselves, from just knowing what to ask, or from playing dumb. I mean, I think a little Columbo is really useful when you're investigating. I don't really, could you explain again? Because I don't really get that. All right, one more, and then I'm going to let people go. Oh. Oh, okay.
But I did just have a comment. I found that not only talking to, not even only looking at the police reports from was important to get
Not only reading police reports, but actually talking to the officers involved. Yeah, and I've learned important things that way also. One thing, while we're here, please stay, and then we'll call it a day.
Can you address the situation
right.
when there's domestic violence and Child Protective Services becomes involved and they may end up removing the children, and the non-battering parent remains with the batterer? Are there treatment programs for the non-battering parent, and are there evaluations for whether they're able to protect the children?
So the question is, what do we do in situations, and this is less in the post-separation context, but we're talking about families that are still together, child protection is involved, and mom is, for whatever reason, denying the violence, staying very closely allied to the abuser. So I'm going to say in 3 minutes what I would normally say in half an hour on this question and try to point you in some directions towards where to get more information about this. But first of all, one possibility is that she's terrified. So one possibility is this is actually not a low-risk case, but a particularly high-risk case. So one of the things that we need to look at is what are the overall level of danger here, and we need to do a really profound risk assessment, and there's a potential that children may need some time out of the house. However, part of why mom is being so tight-lipped is because she thinks that's what we're going to do, is take children out of the house. So to the extent that we're actually able to make her feel that maybe we're not going to go that route, we have a better chance of finding out what's going on. So I really discourage Child Protective Services from doing removals unless they have really overwhelming evidence of immediate danger to those children, because that removal is going to essentially torpedo our possibility of ever accomplishing what would have been much more valuable, which is to successfully build a relationship with that mom. Sometimes a removal has to be done, but I'm just saying we have to understand that it comes at a very high cost of our chance of meeting our long-term goals. Relationships, part of it is a matter of time. relationship building takes time. Asking her several times for meetings, coming up with creative ways to try to get her to meet without him present, saying, oh, we always have to have everybody come into the office, and because we need to meet you there. And then miraculously, there's someone who's suddenly telling him that they need him to come in and talk here, and another person's telling her that they need her to come in and talk here, because we're trying to get them apart. Although even then, if she starts to put up too much of a fuss, you might want to let it go. Because sometimes what she's trying to tell you is, anytime I talk separately, I get beaten up afterwards. So don't make me go separately. See, these are things. There's always these nuances. You're always trying to feel these situations out. Some child protective services will require women to go to a battered women's support group. There are different philosophies about whether this is a good idea or not. Some battered women's programs will say she shouldn't ever be required to do something by virtue of being a victim. Why should she be forced to do something when she's not the perpetrator? Other people will argue, but this is a different question here, because there are children involved. It isn't just about her. It's about safety of the children. Some battered women's programs won't take women who are required to be there, in other words, by a child protective service, and some battered women's programs will. Although the moral and ethical questions here are very complicated, I come down on the side that we should accept women who are being required to be at the group, and that although some women are very bitter about it, some women actually do end up reporting that they got some valuable things out of the group that they were required to go to. So even though I'm very reluctant to coerce a battered woman to do anything, in general I don't believe we require things of victims, we require things of perpetrators. In a case where children are involved, I do think sometimes that that's worth doing. You'd have to see what your local battered women's programs policies are about whether they're willing to have a woman who's being required to participate in the battered women's group. We can still sometimes look at ways to serve the children if the parents are willing to have the children in services. And that sometimes can be a way into the family. And sometimes when a mom starts to become educated about how her children are being affected by the violence they're witnessing, she becomes more willing to talk about it or face it than she was before. There's volumes more, I would say. There's a chapter, I did a whole chapter in When Dad Hurts Mom about what Child Protective Services should be doing in a case. And then another place I would point you is to the domestic violence unit at the Child Protective Service in Massachusetts, which is simply called the Massachusetts Department of Social Services. Because the domestic violence unit has created a whole domestic violence protocol for child protective workers. It has created a risk assessment for putting cases in low and medium and high risk categories, and also has employed domestic violence specialists on staff. In other words, they pioneered, there are other states that do this now, Massachusetts pioneered having battered women's advocates on the CPS staff to work with women, sometimes to work with the abuser. There are cases in Massachusetts where even if both parents are denying the violence, the batterer is still required by CPS to go to a batterer program. And we, at Emerge, where I worked, we had a contract with CPS for years where they paid for clients to attend the batterer program with some value to that. We accomplished some things, particularly, again, sometimes in our ability to build relationships with mom. I've really got to let people go. We're over time, but at least we scratched the surface of a huge question there about CPS. Thank you so much for coming, and be careful out there.
Wrap up housekeeping messages.
Oh, housekeeping messages.
Fill out your evaluation sheet, drop it off when you head out the door. Your certificates if you're getting continuing education. We want to thank Lundy and Mark for gracing us with their presence today. Thank you very much.
You did a wonderful job. I'm quite impressed. Usually I come to this type of thing, I'm like very much double out. You did a wonderful job. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Philip. Thank you.
Yes, she was a good
Don's concern.
Don
Yeah,
is,
that's that.
Okay.
on that. And
Let's-
I think, I just don't, I'm uncomfortable leaving this section without that on the table.
Well, let's correct that, because that's not the intent of this report, is to
That's right.
suggest that there's skullduggery, just inattention to detail. So that's on page 5, top of page 5.
Aren't you mainly talking about how the city reports its budget?
Exactly.
And, and the timeliness of it.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. The difference was later explained to be, or maybe just the difference was later explained, but the underlying documents were not correct at the time they were issued. Is that a correct statement?
To the extent that you know what the correct figures are, they are issued correctly. They change. See, we went from August to December. There were changes, my assumption is changes came down and this enabled part of our budget caused that. And while it's correct, perhaps correct, because I'm not completely literate enough, it may well be correct to say that, well, online you can find it anytime you want to take a look.
No, it wasn't online.
But that's what it said.
That's what
What I got was a preliminary budget to work with, but did have a lower number in it, and that's why we work intensively. When it comes time to validate things in August, we validate from that workbook. And then in